This video is about Beatrice Webb and her democratic socialism. Beatrice Webb is the first of our key thinkers that we can call an evolutionary socialist. She did not believe that revolution was necessary nor advisable when it came to trying to establish the principles of socialism. And before we move on to Webb's thoughts specifically, we'll look at democratic socialism. So Webb was born in 1858. She lives until 1943, so she is particularly active in terms of her research at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Democratic socialists believed that revolution wasn't necessary, it wasn't good for society, it would leave scars on our human nature, and the peaceful transition from capitalism to socialism was possible. And that was because a majority of people, and eventually, therefore, a majority of voters, would gradually and inevitably realise that capitalism didn't work for them, and that they would quite naturally elect socialist politicians, which would result in socialist governments. A socialist government would then gradually take away the ways in which private ownership leaves inequality in society and replace it with state ownership. Voters would realise that this is good for society as a whole and would re-elect those socialist governments. And that continuous election and re-election of democratic socialist governments would produce a socialist society. And I've used that word gradual a couple of times. Beatrice Webb believed in the inevitability of gradualism, that revolution would not bring about socialism. In fact, it would do as much damage as anything else. Webb believed that through the democratic process, socialist parties would form socialist governments, and that would lead from capitalism to socialism. Beatrice Webb and her husband Sidney were active members of the Fabian Society. The logo you can see there on the left. The Fabian Society were committed to socialism, but through democratic reform. And what Beatrice Webb did is she managed to align the Fabian Society with the Labour Party, which at the turn of the 20th century was emerging as a political force. But the Labour Party isn't really going to win elections until the vote is extended across the working class. So it's after the first couple of decades of the 20th century, after 1919, when the electorate expands as a result of the Representation of the People Act, that working class men in particular now have the vote. And so with the Labour Party now a reasonable political voice. I mean, in 1918 it's not the biggest or the most successful party, but it's certainly emerging in politics. Beatrice Webb and the Fabian Society believed that socialism could be achieved through the democratic process. And part of the Labour Party's constitution was Clause 4, and Beatrice Webb was significant in the drafting of the constitution and that particular clause. And you can see there it says that the Labour Party's mission was to secure for the workers, by hand or by brain, the full fruits of their industry, find the most equitable distribution thereof that may be possible upon the basis of common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. So in similarity to Marx, Webb believed that common ownership of the means of production was essential for bringing socialism about. But Webb rejected the concept that there must be a revolution in order for that to happen. So, Beatrice Webb, I said that she conducted some painstaking research, and here is the key text for Beatrice Webb. We're just going to call it the Minority Report. So let's look at the 4 principles of Beatrice Webb's socialism. First of all, capitalism. Capitalism is the cause of poverty and inequality in society, according to Webb. So Webb and Marx and Engels are in agreement there. Capitalism is at fault for crippling inequality in society. And it creates these what Beatrice Webb calls unnatural levels of greed and selfishness. She also believes that paternalism, and you will have looked at that in your study of conservatism, and charity was not a suitable solution to the problems of poverty and inequality. Remember that Webb has lived through the late Victorian era into the early 20th century, in the days before a welfare state, and she believes that individual charity or a paternalist approach to government was not enough to deal with poverty. Third, the best way to remove poverty was active, healthy trade union action amongst workers and state intervention in the economy to reduce inequality. And then finally, and most importantly, this idea of gradualism, that over time, capitalism will be removed from the economy. The economic system of capitalism will be removed, but its effects on society and therefore the individual will be removed over a long period of time. She argues that revolution will leave scars on our human nature and will prolong class conflict. And so she is advocating a long-term, gradual approach to the replacement of capitalism. So let's talk about the Minority Report. In 1905 to 1909, Beatrice Webb served on a Royal Commission, and that Royal Commission was researching poverty. And from that research that she did, she produced the Minority Report. She argued that it was the government's job to provide sufficient nourishment and training when young, a living wage when able-bodied, treatment when sick, modest but secure livelihood when disabled or aged. So we'll just read through the lines there. Sufficient nourishment and training when young, that is essentially free school meals and a free state education. A living wage when able-bodied, so when able to work, that your wage should be enough for you to live a life that, you know, we have these conversations today about what constitutes a living wage compared to the minimum wage. So good wages for workers, treatment for the sick, and a modest but secure livelihood when disabled or aged. So state benefits in the form of disability and pension benefits. She's writing this in the first decade of the 20th century. Nearly 40 years later, we're going to get the Beveridge Report during the Second World War advocating the very same things. And in 1945, we're going to get the first Labour government ruling in its own right, who are going to implement those very ideas from the Beveridge Report. So Beatrice Webb is well ahead of her time in advocating for democratic socialism, and a lot of what she was advocating in the first decade of the 20th century was introduced in the 1940s. Okay, finally, I just want to talk about Webb's most important idea from our perspective, which is gradualism and the inevitability of gradualism. So, as I've suggested a couple of times, Webb rejects the Marx and Engels interpretation that revolution is both inevitable and necessary. Webb agrees with Marx and Engels on one thing: socialism is inevitable, but it will not be brought about through revolution. It will happen gradually. It will happen over a long period of time through piecemeal reforms using the existing state. And that's because in an age of universal suffrage, which Webb was not living in, certainly not when she was writing the Minority Report, but in a world of universal suffrage, when the working men and women were given the vote, the working class would constitute a majority of the electorate, and they would be able to rebel against the exploitation of capitalism by voting for socialist political parties. If they made a majority of the people willing to vote, they didn't have to have a revolution. They could vote for a political party representing their interests. And so what these socialist parties would do is win elections, form governments, and gradually reform capitalism, taking control of the means of production and bringing them into public ownership. And it would be that reform over a longer period of time that would produce socialist society and over a long time shape our human nature, bring out those natural qualities of cooperation, altruism, and a fraternal approach. Because socialism would be superior to capitalism in all ways, because it would improve our human nature, because it would improve the economy, because it was ethically superior to capitalism, this transformation would become permanent. Because society, not just the working class voting for the Labour Party, society would realise that this is a better way to run a nation, to run a society, and a better, more effective state. And as a result of that, as gradualism develops, as the creation of a socialist state evolves, more and more people, or the people Marx and Engels would call the bourgeoisie, would also get on board, because in all ways Webb believed socialism to be superior to capitalism, and she believed that with a gradual approach it would bring the former bourgeoisie, as Marx and Engels called them, on side. She actually argued that the opposite, that what Marx and Engels were suggesting, that the revolutionary approach, that would leave scars on our human nature. And therefore a gradualist approach is not just inevitable, but preferable to.